So let's talk about the strongest and weakest voracious bugs in the 9th edition Tyranid Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids. The bugs are out in force, as we're going to be going through every single unit in the Codex and talk about how strong or weak they're looking in the new book. The Codex hasn't been out all that long just yet. It's going to be interesting to see how people put it into action in tournaments, but seeing as we've had a rather long time where the Tyranid Codex has been leaked and people have been able to experiment with it, I think we are starting to see which units are going to be most commonly included in the strongest lists. With that in mind, I've organised the Codex into 4 different tiers, starting with Tier 4 the weakest, and moving forward to Tier 1 the strongest. We'll talk through each and every unit in turn, some of its greatest strengths and weaknesses, and why I've chosen to rank it where I have. As always with these lists, I do appreciate any feedback you have. I'm sure there might be a few choices that will wind up that I probably should have ranked a little bit higher or a bit lower, and please let me know if you have any insights about given units that you think I might have misjudged slightly. If there's anything I think I might have got majorly wrong, I'll post a correction or two in a pinned comments down below. In any case, let's jump right into it, start with the weaker Gribblies, and then make our way towards the strongest. So first up, in Tier 4, units that I do think are really quite weak for the cost and probably won't see a lot of play in the strongest lists, it's mainly the Spore units in my opinion. Spore Mines and Mucilid Spores I think really are quite weak for the cost. Their new rules mean that they just don't really screen any enemy units or do much aside from their damage, and being able to get into the right position to actually deliver their damage is really quite unreliable, and they're fairly bad for the points even if they're triggered. Against lighter infantry, for example, if you charge them straight into Spore Mines, the Tyranid player with the Spore Mines is likely going to be losing more value than the Horde player is. Generally, I just wouldn't really bother with these buying them in. If you really want to play with Spore Mines, there's a fair few options for spawning them in, and I'd go for one of those instead. Possibly one of the options I wouldn't go for though is the Spore Assist. I think Spore Assists are a little bit more used than the Spore Mines and the Mucilid perhaps. This thing will sit in the midfield, generating Spore Mines, plus dealing out a little bit of shooting. Unfortunately though, it's just really not very tough. For almost 100 points worth of cost, it might struggle to set up with those 3-inch outside terrain fortification issues, and putting immobile fortifications near the enemy is often a bit of a liability. It could conceivably be used to hide in combat and prevent your Tyranids from shooting the enemy. I think there's almost always going to be better ways to spend your points, unless you're just using one for the fun. Moving up into Tier 3, and we've got a whole load of units here that I think are okay, are just perhaps overshadowed by other choices. First up we have the Ripper Swarms, heavily downgraded since their previous incarnation where they were troops with Obsec. Now they're a fast attack choice. They are still a cheap unit that can deep strike and have kind of okay toughness. I guess could be interesting enough for a chaff annoyance unit, but I think there's plenty of other reasonable options for that within the Codex. With a ridiculously low damage output on their attack, they're just really not going to achieve that much. Perhaps an annoyance unit could be okay to screen or swipe objectives quite cheekily, but I don't think you're getting a very good return on your investment here. Next up we have the Tyrannifex, which I'd say is a bit on the opposite end of Tier 3. I would have been sort of tempted to put it up towards Tier 2. It's kind of an interesting weapon beast in that it's got really quite decent toughness. 17 wounds, toughness 8 and a 2+ save is quite good for 170 to 190 points. I'm just maybe not super enthused about its damage output. The Rupture Cannon does have the potential to hit very very hard, but it can easily get foxed by high invuls. And I feel with the Tyrannifex in general you have to commit to one of 3 very different gun profiles, some of which might be completely useless in the matchup that you're in. The Rupture Cannon is going to be underwhelming if there's no really hard targets to throw it into, same with the Flesh Borers being weak if there aren't any hordes. In general I feel like an Exocrine is a better all-round generalist, but there's no denying that if you roll really well on the Rupture Cannon it could hit very very hard indeed. I'd say either upper tier 3 or lower tier 2 for this guy. Next up we have the Auspex, a general purpose melee bruiser who can either hit with lots of attacks with the maw or a few fewer attacks with its claws, and it is again at least fairly tough with toughness 8 and its 2+ save. It is maybe just a bit monodimensional though. I don't think it competes amazingly versus Carnifexes or Hive Tyrants if you want melee threats, but still I don't really think it's all that bad for the cost. Next up we have the Toxicrine, which again is pretty interesting, but I think just suffers from being fairly hyper specialised and really quite close range. This thing's going to absolutely obliterate 1 wound infantry that it gets close to, but it's going to be a bit useless against hard targets, and with melee monsters like this you're often not going to have the best choice as to what you're going into. It does have a couple of handy close range abilities though, a -1 to hit, generating some mortal wounds and a chance to prevent fallback. I think its damage output is just going to look a little bit weedy though if it does wind up fighting against vehicles or just heavy infantry with a whole load of wounds. Next up we have the Broodlord, a general purpose HQ with a little bit of psychic, some melee, and quite interestingly the forward deployability, so you could threaten first turn charges if you're brave, but I feel it's probably going to get overlooked in the HQ section just between all the other ones that are available. It just perhaps doesn't feel like your first choice of HQ compared with Hive Tyrants, Neurothropes, or maybe even Tyranid Primes. Still though, I think the datasheet is still pretty decent and usable, just maybe a little bit overshadowed within the Codex. Next we have the Trigon and Trigon Prime, the big burrowing critters that spit out 12 attacks at strength 7 and damage 2 if they do make it into combat, plus a little bit of close range anti-infantry shooting. Again, don't really seem too bad on their stat line, but are going to be struggling to compete against the other Tyranid monsters. Carnifexes and Morlocks I think give the regular Trigon a run for its money, and outside of a few niche builds I think Primes are going to really struggle to compete with Hive Tyrants. Rerolls and psychic abilities are great on their own, never mind having generally better melee. There are quite a few ways of making quite long deep strike charges in Codex Tyranids though, so I guess that is a mark in their favour. Next we have the Hive Crone, a pretty decent Tyranid flyer, and it has quite a nice focus on killing enemy units with fly. Its main problem is being compared to the Harpy, which just seems massively better in just about every way. The only real major advantage this guy has I think is that extra melee that it gets from its spur, but that's just nowhere near enough to outweigh the extra firepower and the bombing abilities that the Harpy has, so I think you'd rarely ever see this guy compared with Harpies. For all their fancy strength 5 AP-1 flesh borers, I still think that arguably termagants are really quite a lot weaker in this new book I'm afraid. The main reason that while they gained a bit of strength on their gun, going from 5 points to 7 points is a massive nerf, and even from a firepower point of view, they were probably still better on their base stats with those 3-shot strength 4 devourers that are now gone. They do have some pretty reasonable stratagem support and some nice synergy with the Turvagon, which is interesting, but I feel that they're just in the awkward position of being a fairly cheap chaff unit that's just costed a bit too much for that role. I feel like in most lists they're going to lose out to the boosted move of the Gargoyles. I feel like these guys are probably most interesting if you're going to be building around a Turvagon. I think it's perhaps a similar kind of story for the Hormagaunts. They have decent speed at 10-inch move and scrabble out 3 attacks at strength 3 AP-1, though sadly hitting on 4s. Again, they've got some access to some pretty interesting buffs throughout the Codex, but it's just kind of hard to get over how inefficient the actual base datasheet is for the damage and defense. 8 points per model is really quite painful for a supposed horde unit. I think perhaps both these and the Termagants can get kind of interesting if you really build around them and layer lots of buffs on them, but it might just be kind of tricky to justify that compared with layering buffs on other options, maybe things like warriors. Next up we have Biovores, spitting out D3 Spore Mine shots, taking a bit of a nerf from the previous codex in that they can only fire out of line of sight if something synapse can see their targets. Being able to lay down mortal wounds where you need them certainly is kind of handy, though I think you do pay a pretty high price for that ability. Against most targets their damage output really isn't going to be very exciting. I guess they could help to contribute to a bit of area denial with some spore mines maybe. Next up we have Hiveguard, drastically toned down from their previous all-destroying version in the previous codex with the double shooting. Their impaler cannons are only 24 inches and again need a synapse unit to see their targets, though the shot cannons do seem pretty interesting, though definitely a lot better against vehicles than most targets. Overall they feel like a unit that's really quite tough for the cost, but don't really spit out all that much damage, and not being core means they have a fair bit less access to buffs. I feel like they're not really going to be the go-to unit if you do want a gun battery. Finally we have the Lictor, a unit that's got a very different role in the new book from the old. They're a lot more expensive but a lot more threatening, a lot more of an expensive utility unit than anything else perhaps. They can happily chew through elite infantry with a bunch of attacks with 2 damage, are quite nice for a counter-charge option within your deployment zone, popping up for an easy 6-inch charge on the enemy, and can help to deliver other Tyranid bugs into combat with their pheromone trail, very nice for supporting other deep strikers. Maybe I might have ranked Lictors a tiny bit higher than this, but I feel that if you're going to include a Lictor in your army, it's probably going to be a Death Leaper. For the extra 25 points over the standard one, I feel like you're getting a pretty decent return on that investment. Next up we're moving on to Tier 2, units that are considered really quite strong and usable in good army lists, though maybe not at the very apex of the Tyranid Predator hierarchy. I will just say that out of this list, Hive Tyrants and Swarm Lords I did move up into Tier 1. Not entirely sure why I was originally feeling that they were ranked lower than the Winged Hive Tyrants. I don't really feel that they're significantly further behind to be honest. Anyway, we'll start out with the Parasite of Mortrex, a ridiculously fast and threatening character with Synapse, perhaps one of the better utility type units in the whole Tyranid Codex, able to jump out from cover within your deployment zone and potentially charge something very, very far away. I feel like perhaps its best intended role is to bully small squads, skew a whole load of light infantry, and spawn rippers out of others, though its damage output is kind of bad if you just charge him in on the front line. I think it's a pretty interesting option, particularly when combined with his enfolding strike stratagem for 1 CP. I would say probably on the lower end of tier 2 though. Next up we have the Venomthropes, I think a pretty interesting unit to have a small squad of as part of your battle line, giving you a -1 to hit to your nearby Tyranid units against enemy ranged attacks. That alone is kind of enough to justify. They might be able to help out with things like actions and objectives as the swarm moves up, and if your forces are assailed they can always chip in combat as well. They're pretty reasonable in terms of anti-infantry melee damage and have a chance to prevent fall back. I feel they are perhaps a unit that's fairly matchup specific though. If your opponent's army is mainly psychic or melee heavy, they aren't going to have as much effect, or if they have some way of ignoring modifiers. The Tyrannocyte can now deliver your units turn 1 and functions like the Tyranid drop pod you might expect it to. Really quite nice for the potential for a first turn charge from a monster, or maybe a whole bunch of pyrophores piling out to flame spurt the enemy to death. You are paying a fairly steep price for that first turn delivery, 100 points, but you do get a 15 wounds toughness 7 annoyance monster with a little bit of shooting. It's certainly going to make itself a lot more of a nuisance than say something like a Space Marine drop pod. Next up we have the Gene Stealers, a unit that vastly changed in role, losing their advance and charge. Now for 16 points per model, they're basically the forward deployment option for the Tyranids, seizing control of the midfield and stopping the enemy from doing the same with their similar units. It is pretty interesting to have them out there in the front with their high AP and multiple attacks in melee. It was kind of a shame that they don't have the weapon skill 2+ that the pure strains have from the Genestealer Cult Codex though. I feel unless you've got a way to redeploy them, they are going to be fairly vulnerable to Alpha Strike if you're going second. Lining up for a first turn charge and hoping for the best I think could be a way to lose a big unit 1 in every 2 games. I suspect that we'll see more people using them in smaller 5-man squads, more for area denial and a bit of opportunistic munching on enemy infantry. Tyrant Guard are helpfully extending Games Workshop's never-ending bodyguard shenanigans onto Hive Tyrants now, and now Hive Tyrants really seem to be something that you're definitely going to want in a list. The usefulness of these guys has gone up quite a bit. They're really quite sturdy, at 4 wounds, toughness 6 and a 2+ armor save, and they should be able to bully some enemy infantry if they get too close, and they're better near a Hive Tyrant. Allowing Hive Tyrants to operate a lot more bravely though is really quite a big advantage. They could hide out of line of sight, and even if they don't, they are really quite hard to chew through with most guns. Old One Eyes, the super regenerating character Carnifex, really quite expensive at 220 points, but he hits like an absolute truck when he charges, usually 8 attacks at strength 10, AP -4 and damage D3+2, and plenty more from his secondary attacks. Having that kind of massive threat on a character protected Carnifex is going to be quite spooky in the middle of your army. Hopefully he should be able to get the Alpha Strike, jump out and just absolutely delete something. And if he does take some incidental damage, he does have quite a powerful regeneration ability to heal a bunch of wounds. The main downside is the fairly steep points cost though. Next up we have the Gargoyles, which I think out of the swarms are probably the strongest right now. They have fast moving Obsec with 12-inch move and fly for just 80 points, which is usually going to be kind of useful, just piling on that ability onto far-flung objectives. It's something that a lot of armies can't really do. The Flesh Borers can spit out a little bit of strength 5 AP -1 fire, though I still think that their damage and defense isn't particularly outstanding for the cost. You're mainly paying a premium for fast-moving Obsec chaff. They can also debuff the enemy with blinding venom if they charge alongside something, which could be quite helpful for supporting a dedicated melee unit. Up to tier 2 and we have the Tervigon, a datasheet that I actually think is perhaps more interesting than the Termagants it supports, and if Termagants were a little bit better, I feel like them and Tervigons could be an interesting pick. It is a bit on the pricey side at over 200 points, but does come loaded with 10 Termagants ready to spawn, and should hopefully add a fair bit more value over the rest of the game, replenishing a whole bunch of gaunts to a squad each turn. It's at least fairly tough to take out with 17 wounds and a 2+ save, and at least does a little bit of threat in all phases, a little bit of Stinger Salvo anti-infantry fire, 4 attacks with a massive D3+3 damage in combat, and a helpful psychic power and synaptic link ability that allows it to help out nearby Termagants. It's quite cool that you can potentially shield it from being shot at all if you have enough Termagants nearby. It does in theory make it a lot more tempting in a horde list where it's not going to be just the only hard target, if you can't shoot it if there's enough hordes to screen. Next up we have Carnifexes, which I'll admit I maybe should have put up in tier 1. I'd either rank them right at the top of tier 2 or towards the bottom of tier 1, I don't really mind between the two of those. They really haven't held back on the vast array of options and combos available to the Carnifexes. You can have just about any mix of guns and melee that you want, plus a whole load of interesting upgrades and extra abilities on top of that, all coming on quite a nice monstrous platform with -1 damage, 9 wounds, toughness 7 and a 2+ save. That helpfully means that they don't degrade, and also they are a core unit to boot. The heavy venom cannon certainly looks pretty tempting, maybe that combined with some manner of combat weapons might be one of the best ways to go. If you want to go for combat, then certainly the Screamer Killer variant does seem really quite efficient as well though. It's kind of hard to argue with 10 attacks at damage 3, even if the strength is only 6. Overall, on the stats alone, I think they're really quite an interesting unit, just might be a tiny bit harder to bring to bear than some of them. I feel like medium-sized monsters with fairly big bases maybe struggle to get practically used quite as well as others in 40k, particularly on slightly cramped battlefields where space might be an issue and they might block each other from moving up. Still though, really solid. I'd expect to see a lot of them used in competitive Tyranid lists. Next up we have the Morlock, who I'd rank a bit further towards the bottom of tier 2. Perhaps not as big of a massive threat in itself as some of the other monsters, but really quite a cheap and irritating one I think for 125 points. Its damage output is fairly specialised, a massive 16 attacks but only at strength 7 and AP -1 damage 1, so it's largely going to be wanting to hunt light infantry if it can. But I think just including one of those for that terror in the deep rule could be really quite good, just to annoy the centre of the opponent's army by declaring it and watching them all have to scamper out the way of a hopefully key position. It's not really very good against hard targets, but also I think it has enough attacks that you're not usually going to be able to ignore it. Hopefully it can draw some fire from the rest of the more expensive bugs. As I mentioned, the Hive Tyrant and Swarmlord have moved up to tier 1. And finally we have the Tyranid Prime, a really quite cheap and usable HQ choice I think, still nowhere near as essential as things like Hive Tyrants, but if you're using a decent amount of warriors that are really quite strong, then I don't really see anything wrong with bringing it along. And the Synaptic Imperative for exploding 6s in combat is going to be generally useful if you're using a fair amount of melee. At least it packs a fair bit of melee threat now with that damage 2 Bone Sword compared with what it did before. Finally we get on to tier 1, and the units that are looking like some of the strongest and most efficient picks in the entire codex. Starting out, we'll talk about the trio of powerful psychic bugs that I think are going to be seen in quite a lot of Tyranid lists. Neurothropes are 100 points for a pretty ridiculously reliable Psyker in the HQ slot. They get a +1 to cast, and they can make one of your units cast on 3d6 drop the lowest, quite good to be applied to the Maliceptor. The Tyranid psychic powers are pretty decent, Catalyst and Onslaught are both staples, or you can just lean into throwing out even more mortal wounds. It's also pretty decent in defense, it's one of the rare 3+ invul save units within 40k, and it can regenerate wounds onto nearby Zoanthropes if enemy units take mortal wounds in the psychic phase. Its Synaptic Imperative is pretty nice as well if you are going to be combining it with multiple Zoanthropes or Maliceptors or things. It could provide a pretty powerful swing as well against other heavy psychic armies, perhaps other Tyranids or things like Grey Knights or Thousand Suns. Next up, and one of the most threatening bugs in the Codex, is the Maliceptor. If it's on top bracket, then it's an absolute huge mortal wound threat and can do so after advancing and casting powers as well. If it manages to get off a trio of psychic powers, and that's going to be a flat 9 mortal wounds on your closest enemy, never mind what the powers did themselves. Usually it'll be casting 2 powers per turn, but you can pay 1 command point for a third. On top of that, it's really tough to take down, a 4+ invul, -1 strength on ranged attacks if it manages to do its psychic action, and potentially only wounded on a 4+ if you're playing Leviathan maybe. Finally, if you haven't obliterated whatever is close with your psychic, it's still got some OK melee and Horned Chitin for more mortal wounds when it charges in. Pretty nice on top of that ridiculous psychic already. Finally, for Psychobogs we have the Zoanthropes. I think at least one small unit of these is going to be included in virtually every Tyranid list, just to activate that Synaptic Imperative that's arguably the best, the one that gives the vast majority of the army either a 5+ or 4+ invul save if they're within Synapse range. It's just a ridiculously good defensive buff. Aside from that, I'd say they're kind of okay. 3 Zoanthropes are usually going to be chucking out 5 or more mortal wounds for a smite, as they get an extra 1 for each Zoanthrope within the unit, and they are at least fairly annoying to shift as well, with toughness 5, 4 wounds and a 4+ invul save. Next up, and for a datasheet that's arguably the strongest in the entire codex, we have the Harpy. I already covered this one in its own video, but it's basically just a crazily undercosted flyer, essentially strong on every single level. Packing 2 heavy venom cannons, you've got 6 effective super las cannons, plus some stinger salvos for infantry, and that'd be kind of enough to justify it just on its own with its great mobility. However, that's not all it brings. It also has a strong bombing attack to deal some mortal wounds, has the option to fight in melee unlike most flyers, and is also really tough as well. Far more so than most flyers with a similar cost, toughness 7, 13 wounds and a 3+ save with -1 to hit. Quite a common choice to be upgraded to Synapse as well, on a very mobile platform. That will also help out its durability if you're playing Leviathan. I think including a couple of these swooping about on the battlefield is almost never going to be a particularly bad choice. I bet Games Workshop will adjust these guys' points cost at some stage. Next up we have the Warriors. I think previously the Tyranid troop section was fairly well balanced. I feel like if you actually want to deal damage, Warriors are perhaps the way to go now. They're cheap and fairly tough, toughness 5, 3 wounds, and again great in Leviathan with their Synapse, and it is a bit weird that if you want some cheap Obsec troops, these are basically no more expensive than the Swarms, 75 points for a minimum size unit, so are only running you 5 points more than Termagants with 10 models. Compared with those though, they pack far more damage. I feel like Death Spitters for a bunch of Strength 5 AP -2 shooting, and Bone Swords for some damage 2 melee are a pretty good all-rounder choice, and they've got a fair amount of other interesting customizable options, other heavy weapons within the unit, toxin sacs or adrenal glands, and as a core unit within the Codex, they can access a whole ton of buffs. I certainly feel like a few armies would struggle with just mass warriors in Leviathan and not be able to do enough damage to them while they grind you down. Next up, and maybe one of the better longer range weapon beasts of the Codex, is the Exocrine. Not really too much fancy to say about this, other than it's just an all-round good gun platform. 170 points for 15 wounds, toughness 8 and a 2+ save will keep it fairly safe, and then it's usually going to be striking out with 8 shots at strength 8, AP -4 and damage 3, very general purpose. It's not really going to feel particularly wasted whether you're firing at light infantry, medium infantry or heavies. For that reason, I think it's usually going to be the better choice over the Tyrannifex. The damage output of that one's going to be better against its chosen targets, but it's nowhere near as much of a general purpose beast as the Exocrine. Next we have the Hive Tyrants, and as I've mentioned, I have chosen to rank the Winged one, the Regular one, and the Swarm Lord all up in Tier 1. I feel like it'd be a fairly rare Tyranid list that you're not going to want at least one of these, and it might be a fairly sensible idea to take multiple with different detachments. I really like the options that you get between the two. The Winged Tyrant has the enormous 16-inch threat range with decent melee options, but if you sacrifice some of the mobility, then you're gaining toughness 8, a 2+ save, and more offensive weapons. On top of that, they get psychic powers, a reroll ability for one unit, a great place for relics and warlord traits, and the ability to hide from being shot with Tyrant Guard now, and he's got a very efficient big leader beast. Currently the Walking Hive Tyrant is allowed to take 2 sets of heavy venom cannons, which can make him a pretty crazily efficient shooting option as well, though it does seem likely that that could be an oversight that's patched out by Games Workshop at a later date. I think out of the two, the Winged Tyrant might be a bit more popular, soup it up with a melee weapon and have it jumping around the board killing things, but they both do seem pretty good. Finally we've got the Swarm Lord, a bit more expensive at 220 points. He's a dedicated melee monster and a little bit slower, both of which do count in his negative, but I think getting full rerolls on one Tyranid monster, as well as having pop-up Obsec on a unit, both are pretty interesting things that could well be worth it. I feel like we'll probably not see quite as many Swarm Lords as the other two though, partly just for being able to deploy good warlord traits and relics and having a bit more flexibility. Next up we have Death Leaper, a pretty interesting little pop-up little murder threat, basically doing everything that Lictors do but perhaps a little bit better. He gets more attacks, a 4+ invul save, the character keyword, and a couple of other little interesting tricks. I think perhaps one of the more interesting things about Death Leaper is that he can take the Alien Cunning Warlord trait, which does make him Obsec and counts as 5 models, so it could be a potentially very interesting way to jump out, kill a whole bunch of enemies, and then take away the objective that they were standing on. Like the regular Lictor, he can get some very short charges if the enemy is somewhat close to your deployment zone, and can also use Pheromone Trail to support your other units. Next up we have the Raveners, which are put towards the bottom end of Tier 1. Maybe I've ranked these guys a little bit too high compared with other damage dealers, but they do seem like a nice combo of fast, tough and murderous in combat to me. They cost 30 points rather than the 25 of Warriors, but they gain a 12-inch move so they're a lot more likely to make melee, and get 5 or more attacks apiece, and a -1 to hit in combat too. They seem like really quite a nice choice for just jumping forward and chewing up enemy infantry, though they do have some trade-offs including losing Synapse and they won't be Obsec. Perhaps they might be a little bit overvalued up in Tier 1, maybe higher Tier 2 might have been a bit more appropriate. Finally though, and perhaps most improved unit in the Codex, we have the Pyrovores, again another unit that I've covered in its own video. For 30 points, the stat lines that you get on these things really are very impressive. 5 wounds at toughness 5 and a 3+ save is very good durability for that cost, and their anti-infantry damage output is impressive as well, either d6 strength 6 damage 2 flamer hits, or 2d6 at strength 4 AP -1, really quite respectable at clearing out infantry, whether we're talking space marines or hordes. You could use them in small squads of 3 as damage dealers, but they're pretty nice individually as well. 30 points for an irritating, tough little critter hiding in terrain somewhere could be really quite frustrating for the opponents, particularly when, if they roll well, they could well be burning down entire squads of enemy chaff infantry that are trying to sneak onto your objectives. Perhaps could be a fun unit to have hiding in strategic reserve as well. So anyway, I think that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Tyranid tier list. There's plenty of really quite strong looking bugs in this new Codex. I do feel maybe it's a bit skewed towards the monsters and heavy hitters though. I can't help but feel that the gaunt swarms are just a bit underwhelming in this Codex. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, including if there's any units that you think I should have ranked higher or lower. As always, I look forward to hearing your opinions. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I tend to have new ones coming out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the channel has a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.